The camping trip we never finished. Silence in nature isn't peace. It's a predator holding its breath. I learned that the hard way. There were 4 of us when we entered that remote reserve, drawn by a forum post promising perfect night skies. But we didn't find stars. We found a silence so heavy it felt like physical pressure, and a smell rising from the damp earth. Copper, sharp and unmistakable. Old blood. We thought we were alone in the black pines, but when the sun dropped like a stone and the firelight flickered against the encroaching dark, the pacing began. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Always just beyond the light. We didn't finish that trip, and judging by the wet, heavy footsteps circling my suburban home tonight at exactly 3:17 a.m., the trip isn't finished with me.
Chapter 1. The Dead Zone.
I sniffed the air, frowning. Do you guys smell that? Daniel was already unloading the trunk, hoisting a cooler. Smells like mud and sap. Come on, help me with the tents. We're losing light. I looked at Scott and Mia. Scott was stretching, oblivious. Mia was hugging her cardigan tighter around herself, staring into the tree line. She looked pale. Neither of them mentioned the smell. I kept my mouth shut, forcing myself to grab my pack. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was something in the soil. We hiked about 200 yards into the timber to find the clearing Daniel had read about, the perfect night sky spot. The clearing was perfectly round, a break in the canopy that felt almost surgical. The ground was spongy, covered in a thick layer of gray moss that dampened our footsteps. We set up the tents in a semicircle, mine and Daniel's on the left, Scott and Mia's on the right, with the fire pit in the center. As I hammered the stakes into the ground, the soil wept dark, oily water. The metallic stent flared up, stronger now, making my stomach turn. I wiped my hands on my jeans, leaving dark smears that looked too much like dried rust. "Hey," Mia said, her voice small. She was standing near the edge of the trees. Scott looked up from the fire pit he was building. "Migrated? Sleeping?" "All of them?" Mia asked. "There's nothing here. No bugs. Look at the lantern." She pointed to the battery-powered lantern Scott had set on a stump. Usually in the woods, a light source becomes a beacon for moths and mosquitoes within seconds. The plastic casing was pristine. Nothing was swarming, nothing was buzzing. "Maybe it's too cold," Daniel said, though it was humid enough to make my shirt stick to my back. He struck a match and tossed it into the kindling. The fire caught instantly, hungrily, roaring up with a crackle that sounded shockingly loud in the dead air. "Relax, guys, you're just city shocked. Give it an hour. We'll have some beers, look at the stars, and you'll forget all about the creepy quiet." We tried to settle in. We opened the beers, we cooked hot dogs that tasted like ash, but the relaxation never came. The sun didn't set so much as it was extinguished. I had been watching the sky, waiting for the promised view. The light was a bruised purple filtering through the high branches. Then, within the span of 5 minutes, the color drained away completely. There was no golden hour, no twilight gradient.
The world simply turned gray, and then absolute black. It was a darkness that felt physical. The light from the fire didn't seem to travel as far as it should have. It hit the wall of trees and died, swallowed by the pines. Beyond a radius of 10 feet, the world ceased to exist. "Okay," Scott said, his voice a little too loud. "That's dark." "Perfect for stargazing," Daniel insisted, leaning back. He looked up. We all looked up. There were no stars. The opening in the canopy, which should have been a window to the galaxy, was just a void. It was overcast, maybe, or perhaps the gloom in this forest was so thick it rose up and choked the sky itself. Mia pulled her knees to her chest. "I want to go home." "Mia, come on," Daniel sighed. "We just got here. We drove 6 hours." "I don't care," she whispered. "Something is wrong. Can you feel it? It's like we're being watched." "Nobody is watching us," Daniel said firmly. "We are miles from the nearest town. Even the locals don't come out here." "Why?" I asked. The word slipped out before I could stop it. "Why don't the locals come here, Daniel?" Daniel hesitated. The firelight cast deep, dancing shadows across his face, making his eyes look hollow. "Because it's remote. That's all." He was lying, I could tell. But before I could press him, the wind picked up. It wasn't a gust. It was a slow, dragging draft that moved through the upper branches. It sounded like heavy fabric being pulled over rough wood. Shh, thump. Shh, thump. We all fell silent, listening to the trees groan. Then, the wind died as quickly as it had started, returning us to that suffocating vacuum. And that's when we heard it. Crunch. It came from the darkness behind Scott. Distinct, heavy, the sound of a boot coming down hard on dry leaves and snapping a twig. Scott froze, his beer halfway to his mouth. "Daniel, stop messing around." Daniel was sitting directly across from him. I didn't move. Crunch. Another step, closer this time, just outside the ring of firelight. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a deer. A deer scampers, a bear shuffles. This was a bipedal, rhythmic cadence. Someone was walking. Scott scrambled up, grabbing his heavy-duty flashlight. He aimed the beam into the wall of black pines. "Hello? Is someone there?" The beam cut through the dark, illuminating rugged bark and hanging moss. Nothing, but the sound didn't stop. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps continued, pacing. They were moving in a wide arc, circling our campsite. They were deliberate, measured, and they were getting closer.
Chapter 2: The Breath of the Void. The beam of Scott's flashlight sliced through the humid air like a solid bar of white plastic, illuminating a chaotic tapestry of pine bark and hanging moss. We all held our breath, waiting for the light to catch a flannel shirt, a denim jacket, the reflective strip of a ranger's boot, anything human. Crunch. The sound was defiant. It came from directly in front of Scott, maybe 15 feet away, right where the beam was focused on a thicket of dead briars. "Who's there?" Scott's voice cracked, betraying the bravado he usually wore like armor. "This isn't funny, man. We have bear mace." He didn't have bear mace. He had a Swiss Army knife and a half-empty bag of marshmallows. Crunch. The step didn't retreat. It moved laterally, sliding to the left, staying perfectly positioned just beyond the reach of the firelight's glow, but clearly within the flashlight's range. Yet the light revealed nothing but empty space and twisted roots. "I don't see anything," Scott whispered, backing up until his calves hit the log he'd been sitting on. "Daniel, I don't see anything." "It's the acoustics," Daniel said. He was standing now, his knuckles white as he gripped a heavy piece of firewood. "The trees, they echo. It's probably a deer or a coyote way back in the brush, and the sound is throwing." "That is not a coyote," I said, my voice barely audible. "That is 2 feet hitting the ground, heavy, rhythmic." We stood in a tight knot around the fire, 4 civilized people reduced to primal prey animals in the span of 10 minutes. The footsteps continued their circuit. It was a slow, mocking pace. Step, pause, step, pause. It was the walk of someone inspecting merchandise. After 5 agonizing minutes, the sound stopped. The silence that rushed back in was worse than the noise. It felt pressurized, as if the air itself had thickened. The metallic smell, that scent of copper and old rain, surged, becoming so potent I could taste it on the back of my tongue. "See," Daniel let out a breath that sounded more like a shudder. He tossed the firewood back onto the pile, though he didn't sit down. "They're gone, probably just some local messing with the city kids, trying to spook us." "Why didn't they answer?" Mia asked. She hadn't moved from her spot near the tent. She was staring at the darkness where the sounds had ceased, her eyes wide and unblinking.
"Because that ruins the joke, Mia," Daniel snapped, though his tone was too sharp, too defensive. He forced a laugh, but it came out brittle. Look, let's just stoke the fire up, make it huge. Nothing comes near a big fire. We'll stay up, drink the beer, and leave at first light if you guys are really that freaked out." He grabbed a handful of dry kindling and threw it onto the flames. The fire licked up greedily, casting long, frantic shadows that danced against the wall of pines. The extra light should have been comforting. Instead, it just made the surrounding darkness feel deeper, more impenetrable. We sat back down. Nobody spoke. Scott kept the flashlight in his lap, turned on, aiming it aimlessly at the ground. I watched the flames, trying to convince myself that Daniel was right. Just a prank, just a local. Then Mia spoke. Her voice was different. It wasn't the scared, shaky whisper from before. It was flat, detached, curiously calm. "Guys, who's standing behind Scott?" The question hung in the air, freezing the blood in my veins. I looked at her. She wasn't looking at us. She was looking just over Scott's left shoulder, her gaze fixed on the empty air directly behind him. Scott didn't turn around. He went rigid, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "Mia," Daniel warned, "stop it." "There's nobody there, Mia," I said, though I found myself leaning away from Scott. "It's just shadows." "No," she murmured, tilting her head slightly as if trying to get a better angle. "He's tall. He's bending down. He's right at your ear, Scott." Scott made a noise, a high, strangled whimper. His hands gripped his knees so hard his fingernails dug into the denim. "Scott?" I asked. "Scott, look at me. There's nobody there." "I can feel it," Scott whispered. Tears were welling in his eyes, spilling over onto his cheeks. Oh God, I can feel it." "Feel what?" Daniel demanded, standing up again. "Breath," Scott choked out. It's hot, it's wet, it's breathing on my neck." I saw the hair on the back of Scott's neck standing up. I saw him flinch, rhythmic and slight, as if puffs of air were hitting his skin. But there was nothing there, just the empty, suffocating night air. "Get up, Scott," Daniel yelled, lunging forward to grab Scott's arm. And then the world ended. There was no flicker, no sputter of dying embers. 1 millisecond, we were surrounded by a roaring bonfire that reached 3 feet into the air.
The next millisecond, we were in absolute crushing blackness. It was as if a giant hand had simply pinched the universe shut. The heat vanished instantly. The light vanished instantly. Even the red glow of the coals was gone. We were plunged into a darkness so total it felt like blindness. "Daniel?" I screamed, thrusting my hands out. "Scott!" I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. "My flashlight!" Scott screamed. "It's dead! It just died!" Panic, raw and chaotic, erupted. I heard bodies colliding, the sound of boots scuffling on dirt, the frantic zipping of zippers. But underneath our panic, underneath the screaming, a sound began to rise from the center of the dead fire pit. It was whispering. It wasn't one voice. It sounded like 3 or 4, overlapping, out of sync. And it wasn't English. It wasn't any language that should be spoken by human tongues. The sounds were guttural, wet and thick, slithering. It sounded like mud bubbling in a swamp, or a throat filled with blood trying to form vowels. Guth, ra, ket, sta. The syllables seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. The metallic smell exploded around us, no longer just a scent, but a physical presence coating my throat, making me gag. It tasted like I was chewing on a rusty spoon. "Light it! Light it!" Daniel was screaming, the click, click, click of a lighter frantic in the dark. The whispering grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the ground anymore. It was moving between us. I felt a displacement of air, cold and clammy, brush past my cheek. Something wet touched my earlobe. Not a hand, but something slick like a slug. I swatted at it, screaming, backing away until I tripped over a root and fell hard onto the moss. Click, whoosh. A tiny flame erupted from Daniel's lighter. He jammed it into a wad of paper towels he'd pulled from his pocket. The flame caught. It was small, pathetic, trembling, but it was light. We scrambled toward it like moths. Daniel fed it twigs, his hands shaking so badly he dropped half of them. Slowly, agonizingly, the fire grew. The whispering stopped the instant the flame took hold. We huddled together, shoulder to shoulder, backs to the fire, staring out into the woods. The flashlight was dead. The lantern was dead.
Only the fire remained. "Is everyone okay?" Daniel wheezed. He looked 10 years older. His face was smeared with soot and sweat. "Scott, OP? I'm here," I gasped, clutching my chest. "I'm here. Scott."
Scott was curled in a ball near the cooler, rocking back and forth. It touched me. It touched me. "Where's Mia?" I asked, a sudden spike of ice in my stomach. We looked around. Mia was sitting exactly where she had been before the lights went out. She hadn't moved. She hadn't screamed. But she wasn't the same. Her skin was the color of old parchment. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated so much her irises were just thin rings of brown. She was staring into the fire, her lips trembling. "Mia?" Daniel moved toward her slowly. "Mia, are you hurt?" She didn't blink. She didn't look at him. She just kept staring into the flames. "He told me," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, as if she had been screaming for hours, though she hadn't made a sound. "Who told you what?" I asked, crawling closer to her. She turned her head slowly. The movement was jerky, mechanical. When her eyes met mine, I saw a profound emptiness there, a void that mirrored the sky above us. "The one who whispered," she said softly. "He leaned right into my ear. He put his lips right against my skin. He was so cold." "What did he say, Mia?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Mia closed her eyes. A single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. "He said, 'You weren't invited.'"
Chapter 3: The Occupant. The fire was back, but the warmth was gone. The flames licked at the air, casting long, frantic shadows that seemed to perform a silent, mocking dance against the wall of black pines. We huddled close to the heat, knees touching, backs exposed to the vast, breathing darkness of the woods. Nobody spoke for a long time. The echo of Mia's whisper, "You weren't invited," hung over us like a guillotine blade. I looked at Mia. She was sitting on a log, wrapped in a blanket that trembled with the subtle vibrations of her body. But her face was a mask of terrifying neutrality. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't looking at us. She was staring past the fire, past the tents, deep into the void where the trees began. It was the look of someone listening to a conversation happening just out of earshot. "We leave at first light," Daniel said. His voice was brittle, stripped of all the confident leadership he'd displayed during the drive-up. He was gripping a hatchet he'd pulled from his gear, his knuckles white. "We pack the car and we get the hell out of here." "Why not now?" Scott asked. His voice was a jagged whine. "Daniel, why not right now?" "Because we can't see 5 feet in front of us, Scott," Daniel snapped, though he kept his voice low. "The road is a mess. If we drive off a ridge or get stuck in the mud in this dark, we're stranded. We wait for the sun." The logic was sound, but it felt like a death sentence. Time began to distort. Without phones, without the moon, without the rhythmic chirping of insects to mark the passage of seconds, the night stretched into an eternity. I checked my watch every few minutes, but the hands seemed to be dragging through syrup. 11:45 p.m., 12:20 a.m., 1:15 a.m. The metallic smell, that scent of old copper and wet earth, came and went in waves. Sometimes it was faint, a background note of rust. Other times it was so strong I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging, the taste of iron coating my tongue. Every time the smell spiked, the fire would dim just a fraction, as if the oxygen in the clearing was being displaced by something else. By 2 a.m., exhaustion began to war with terror. Adrenaline is a finite resource. Eventually, the body crashes. Scott was the first to break. He was nodding off, his head snapping up every time a twig popped in the fire. "I can't," Scott mumbled, rubbing his face. "I can't keep my eyes open." "Stay awake," I urged him. "Just a few more hours."
I need to lay down. Just for an hour. My back is killing me.
He stood up, swaying slightly. He looked at his tent, a small 2-person dome set up about 10 feet from the fire ring. "I'm just going to lie on top of the bag. Keep the zipper open. If anything happens, yell." "Scott, don't," Mia said. It was the first time she had spoken in hours. She didn't turn her head. She didn't blink. Scott paused, one foot moving toward the tent. "What?" "Don't go in there," she whispered to the darkness. "It's crowded." A shiver raked down my spine, cold and sharp. "Mia, what do you mean?" She didn't answer. She just went back to listening to the silence. Scott looked at her, then at Daniel, then back to the tent. Anger, born of fear and fatigue, flashed in his eyes. "Stop it, Mia. Stop trying to freak us out. I'm going to sleep." He marched to his tent, crawled inside, and left the flap unzipped, just as he promised. We watched him collapse onto his sleeping bag. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the rhythmic rasp of sleep. Daniel and I stayed by the fire, feeding it stick by stick. I found myself staring at the darkness between the trees, trying to find shapes in the shadows. My mind played tricks on me. I saw limbs that looked like arms, knots in the wood that looked like faces. And the silence was heavy. It wasn't empty, it was full. It felt like the silence of a room full of people holding their breath, waiting for a cue. 3 a.m. came and went. At 3:15 a.m., the wind picked up again, that same slow, dragging sound in the canopy. Shh. Thump. Like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. Then came the scream. It didn't build up, it erupted. It was a sound of pure animalistic terror, shrieking, garbled, high-pitched. It came from Scott's tent. "Scott," Daniel roared, scrambling up and dropping the hatchet. We rushed the 10 feet to the tent. The scene inside was a nightmare, illuminated by the flickering firelight behind us. Scott was thrashing. He was half in and half out of his sleeping bag, clawing at the ground, dragging himself backward toward the opening. He was kicking violently, his heels drumming against the nylon floor of the tent. "Get it off! Get it off me!" he shrieked, his eyes bulging, veins popping in his neck. Daniel grabbed Scott's arms and yanked him out of the tent, dragging him into the dirt near the fire. Scott scrambled back on his hands and knees, hyperventilating.
"There's something in there," Scott gasped, choking on his own saliva. "In the bag. It was in the bag with me." We looked at the tent. The sleeping bag, a heavy, mummy-style bag rated for 0 degrees, was still inside. And it was moving. It wasn't settling. It wasn't the fabric relaxing. The bag was convulsing. It looked like 2 people were fighting inside it. It rolled over, the nylon swishing loudly, then jerked upward in the center, as if a knee or elbow had struck it from within. "Jesus Christ," Daniel whispered, backing away. The bag thrashed again, violent and jerky. Thump, thump, swish. "Is it an animal?" I yelled, looking for a weapon, grabbing a heavy branch. "Did a raccoon get in?" "It didn't feel like an animal," cried Scott, wiping slime from his face. Sweat? Tears? It felt like skin, wet skin. It wrapped around my legs. The thrashing inside the bag slowed. The violent jerks turned into a slow, rhythmic, undulating motion. It looked like something large was taking a deep breath inside the bound filling. Expand. Contract. Expand. Contract. "We have to open it," Daniel said, though he looked like he was about to vomit. "We have to see what it is." "No," Scott screamed. "Burn it! Just burn it!" "We need the keys, Scott. The car keys are in the pocket of the bag." Scott patted his pockets frantically. Empty. Oh God. Daniel took a step forward. He held the hatchet in one hand. With the other, he reached for the bottom of the sleeping bag, where the zipper pull was dangling. The movement inside the bag stopped instantly. The stillness was worse than the thrashing. It was aware. It was waiting. Daniel's hand shook as he grabbed the zipper.
He looked back at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Ready?" I raised the branch. "Do it." Daniel ripped the zipper upward in one fluid motion, flinging the top layer of the bag open. We all flinched, bracing for teeth, claws, a rabid animal lunging out. Nothing happened. The bag was empty. We stared at it, minds unable to process the physics. We had just seen it moving. We had seen the volume of it, the displacement of space. It was right there, Scott stammered. I felt it. Daniel shined the weak light of his lighter into the interior of the bag. It was empty of solid mass, yes, but it wasn't clean. The inside lining of the sleeping bag, which had been dry blue flannel hours ago, was soaked.
It glistened in the firelight. A thick, viscous slime coated the fabric from the footbox to the hood. Daniel reached out and touched it, then recoiled, wiping his hand on his jeans. "It's warm," he whispered. "Hot, actually." The smell wafted up from the open bag, hitting us with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the metallic smell anymore. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse floor, raw meat, copper, and something sulfurous and ancient. "The keys," I said, pointing. Scott's keys were there, sitting in a small puddle of the translucent slime near the hood of the bag. Daniel used the tip of the hatchet to hook the keyring and drag them out. He didn't want to touch the inside of the bag again. He kicked the bag away, sending it tumbling toward the tree line. "We're leaving," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "Screw the gear, screw the tents. We are leaving right now." "I told you," a voice said softly. We spun around. Mia was standing by the fire. She hadn't moved to help Scott. She hadn't looked at the tent. She was staring at the empty sleeping bag lying in the dirt. "Mia?" I asked. She looked up at me. Her eyes were completely devoid of light, 2 black holes in a pale face. "I told you it was crowded." "Get in the car," Daniel ordered, grabbing Mia's arm. She didn't resist. She felt light, frail, like a bird made of hollow bones. We scrambled around the campsite, grabbing only the absolute essentials: wallets, phones, water. We left the tent standing like monuments to our terror. We left the cooler. We left the chairs. Scott was already at the car, fumbling with the lock, his hands shaking so hard he dropped the keys twice. "Hurry up," I yelled, throwing my backpack into the trunk. The sky was beginning to lighten, not with sunlight, but with a sickly, bruised gray that suggested dawn was fighting a losing battle against the forest. The black pines stood like iron bars against the horizon. We piled into the SUV. Daniel slammed the door and locked it. The sound of the lock engaging was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. The headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the narrow dirt track that would lead us back to sanity. "Is everyone in?" Daniel asked, looking in the rearview mirror. "I'm here," Scott breathed from the passenger seat. "I'm here," I said from the back left. Daniel put the car in drive. Then he paused. He looked in the rearview mirror again. He turned around in his seat. "Where's Mia?" I froze. I looked to my right. The seat next to me was empty. She was right behind me," I stammered, panic seizing my throat. "I saw her. Daniel, I saw you grab her arm." "I let go of her at the trunk," Daniel said, his voice rising to a scream. "I thought she got in." We looked out the windows. The campsite was silent. The fire was dying down. The tents flapped gently in the morning breeze. There was no sign of Mia. "Mia!" I screamed, pounding on the glass. We scrambled out of the car, shouting her name. We ran back to the fire circle. We checked her tent. It was zipped shut. "Mia!" I ripped the zipper of her tent open. Her shoes were there, neatly placed by the door. Her phone was plugged into the portable battery, the screen dark. Her sleeping bag was rolled up, untouched. "Mia!" Scott screamed, spinning in circles. And then we heard it.
From deep in the woods, far beyond where the light of the fire could reach, came a sound. Knock, knock, knock. 3 heavy, hollow sounds against wood, like a fist hitting a coffin lid. Silence. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't an answer. It was an invitation.
The engine of the SUV hummed, a vibration that should have been comforting, a tether to the mechanical, rational world we came from. Instead, it felt like a countdown. "We can't leave her," Daniel said. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight the leather squeaked. He was staring at the empty seat where Mia should have been. "Scott, we can't just drive away." "She's gone, man." Scott's voice was high, bordering on hysteria. He was hugging his knees in the passenger seat, rocking back and forth. "You saw the tent. You saw the sleeping bag. Whatever was in that bag, whatever took her, it's not human." "We are not leaving her." Daniel slammed his fist against the dashboard, cracking the plastic vent. The violence of the sound silenced Scott instantly. "Get out of the car. We search the perimeter. 10 minutes. If we don't find her, we drive to the ranger station and bring back the cops. But we are looking first." I opened the back door. The air outside had changed again. The humidity had spiked, turning the forest into a steam bath. The gray morning light didn't illuminate. It merely turned the shadows from black to charcoal. And the smell, that copper slaughterhouse stench, was now so thick it felt like a film coating my teeth. We stepped back into the clearing. The fire was a pile of smoldering ash. Mia's tent flap hung open like a slack jaw. "Mia," I screamed. The name left my throat, raw and desperate. I waited for the echo. There was none. The trees swallowed the sound instantly. It was like shouting into a pillow. "Mia," Daniel yelled, cupping his hands. We stood in a triangle, facing outward toward the wall of black pines. We waited. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the north, deep in the density of the woods. It wasn't the random clatter of falling branches. It was deliberate, percussive. 3 distinct strikes of hard bone against hollow wood. "Is that her?" Scott whispered, his eyes starting frantically. "Is she signaling?" "Mia," I called again. "Hit the tree again if you can hear us." Silence. Then, from the same direction, but closer. Knock, knock, knock. "She's leading us," Daniel said, a spark of hope or madness lighting his eyes. He clicked his flashlight on, though the beam was swallowed by the gray mist drifting between the trunks. "Come on, stay close. Physical contact at all times." We moved into the tree line. I grabbed the back of Daniel's jacket. Scott grabbed mine.
We formed a chain of terrified humanity, stepping over the threshold into the deep woods. The terrain changed immediately. The mossy floor of the campsite gave way to a tangle of slick black roots that looked like petrified snakes. The trees grew uncomfortably close together here, forcing us to weave and duck. "Mia," I shouted again, and that was when the second horror hit me. I tried to imagine her answering. I tried to conjure up the sound of her voice in my mind, the pitch, the timbre, the way she laughed. I wanted to simulate the relief of hearing her say, "I'm over here." My mind drew a blank. I stopped walking. "Daniel." He stopped, tension radiating through his jacket. "What? Did you see something?" "Daniel," I whispered, panic rising in my chest like bile. "What does she sound like?" Daniel turned around, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What?" "Mia." Her voice.
Imagine her speaking right now. Can you hear it? Daniel opened his mouth to answer, to dismiss me as crazy. Then he froze. His eyes widened. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head as if to clear a thought. She has a soft voice, he stammered. Kind of high. No, low. I can't remember it, whimpered Scott from behind me. I'm trying to think of her saying my name. It's just static. It's just white noise. That's impossible, Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. We've known her for years. She's Mia. It took her voice, I said, the realization settling into my bones with the weight of lead. Whatever is out here, it didn't just take her body. It's taking her. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was directly ahead of us now, loud, commanding. We have to find her before there's nothing left to find, Daniel said, pushing forward with renewed, desperate energy. We stumbled through the underbrush for what felt like 20 minutes, but could have been 2 hours. The canopy was so thick overhead that the sky was just a memory. The air grew colder, despite the humidity. Then, the trees opened up into a small, unnatural clearing. It wasn't like the campsite. This was a perfect circle of dead earth, about 10 feet in diameter. In the center stood a single, massive pine tree. It was dead, its bark stripped away to reveal smooth, bone-white wood underneath. And it was wet, glistening slime, the same translucent substance that had coated the inside of Scott's sleeping bag, covered the trunk from the roots up to a height of about 7 feet. It pulsed slowly.
Mia? Daniel whispered. We approached the tree slowly. Embedded in the slime, about 5 feet up the trunk, was a single object. It was Mia's glasses. She never took them off. She was blind without them. They were stuck there in the viscous fluid, one lens cracked, hanging askew as if the face wearing them had been pulled violently backward into the tree itself. Oh God, Scott retched, doubling over. She's in the tree. She's inside the tree. Shut up, Scott, Daniel yelled, reaching out toward the glasses. Don't touch it, I grabbed Daniel's wrist. Look at the slime, Daniel. Look closely. He stopped inches from the trunk. We leaned in, shining the flashlight on the wet surface. The slime wasn't just clear fluid. It was filled with thousands of tiny black specks, and they were moving, writhing. It wasn't sap. It was a colony, a biological mass. And then the tree knocked. It didn't come from the woods around us. It came from inside the white trunk. Thud, thud, thud. The vibration traveled through the ground and up through the soles of my boots. Mia, Daniel screamed, tearing his arm from my grip. He slammed the butt of the hatchet against the trunk. Mia, are you in there? Thud, thud, thud. It was an answer. We have to get her out, Daniel gasped. He raised the hatchet, preparing to swing at the white wood. Daniel, wait, I shouted. If she's in there, you'll kill her. She's suffocating, he roared, and he swung. Crack. The hatchet bit deep into the wood, but it didn't sound like chopping a tree. It sounded like chopping through wet ribs. A spray of dark, viscous liquid erupted from the wound in the tree, splattering Daniel's face and chest. It wasn't sap. It was red. Dark, thick, arterial red. The metallic smell exploded outward, overwhelming us. Daniel screamed, dropping the hatchet and clawing at his eyes. It burns! It burns! From the gash in the tree, a sound escaped. It wasn't a voice. It was a hiss, like air escaping a pressurized tire, but layered with that terrible, wet whispering we had heard by the fire. You were... The whisper swirled around the clearing, echoing from every direction at once. Not. Scott was already running. He didn't wait for us. He turned and bolted back the way we came, crashing through the brush like a wounded animal.
Invited. Daniel, run! I grabbed him by the back of his shirt. He was blinded, scrubbing at his eyes.
As we retreated, I looked back one last time. The slime on the tree was reacting to the wound. It was surging toward the cut, bubbling and frothing, knitting the wood back together with unnatural speed. And as it moved, the slime formed shapes, faces, dozens of them, stretching and screaming in silent agony within the gel. One of them looked like Mia, but the mouth was missing. "Run!" I screamed, dragging Daniel into the darkness of the pines. We ran blindly, chasing the sound of Scott crashing through the woods ahead of us. The knocking started up again, but now it was frantic, rapid fire. Knock, 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 knock. It was coming from every tree we passed. Every trunk was beating like a drum. The forest was waking up, and it was angry.
Chapter 5. The Labyrinth of Veins. I didn't run. I scrambled. It was a desperate, clawing motion, half upright, half crawling, dragging Daniel's dead weight through the underbrush. He was screaming, his hands clamped over his face, the dark red fluid from the tree sizzling against his skin like acid on raw meat. "My eyes!" he shrieked, stumbling over a root and nearly taking me down with him. "It's inside my head. I can hear them." "Keep moving," I roared, yanking him up by his collar. The fabric tore, but I didn't let go. "Don't listen to it, Daniel. Just move your feet." The forest had changed. It wasn't just the knocking anymore. The ground itself felt spongy, unstable, as if the layer of moss and dirt was merely a thin skin stretched over something pulsing and alive. With every step, my boots sank inches deep, the soil making a wet, sucking sound, schluck, schluck, that sounded nauseatingly like chewing. We were running blind. The flashlight beam swung wildly, illuminating flashes of terror, a branch that looked like a twisted arm, a knot in a tree that resembled a screaming mouth, the endless, suffocating wall of black pines. We were trying to follow Scott's path, the trail of broken ferns and crushed saplings he'd left in his panic, but the woods seemed to be closing up behind him. Branches whipped at my face, drawing blood. Thorny vines snagged my jeans, pulling tight like tripwires. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was deafening now. It wasn't coming from the distance. It was coming from the trees right next to us. As we passed them, I could feel the vibration in the air, a concussive thud that rattled my teeth. The forest was a drum, and we were the insects trapped on the skin. "Scott!" I screamed, hoping he had reached the car. "Start the engine! Scott!" There was no answer, just the rhythmic pounding of the trees and Daniel's agonized sobbing. "She's in the dark," Daniel whimpered, his voice dropping to a terrifying lucid whisper. He stopped fighting my grip and went limp, forcing me to haul him entirely. "She says it's warm. She says we're all part of the root system now." "Shut up, Daniel," I shoved him forward. "We are leaving." We burst through a thicket of briars and stumbled back into the main campsite clearing. The fire was dead, a circle of gray ash that looked like a blind eye. The tents were gone. I froze, my breath catching in a painful hitch. Where are the tents? We had left them standing not 20 minutes ago. Mia's tent, Scott's tent, mine. They should have been right there. Instead, the clearing was empty. The ground was smooth, undisturbed moss. No tent stakes, no flattened grass, no cooler. It was as if we had never set up camp at all. "We're lost," Daniel groaned, sinking to his knees, clutching his burning face. "We went in circles. This isn't the spot." "It has to be," I said, spinning around, panic tightening my chest like a vice. "The fire pit is right there." I pointed to the ash circle, but as I looked closer, My blood ran cold. It wasn't ash. It was a patch of gray fungus, a perfect circle of mold growing in the dirt, mimicking the shape of a dead fire. It changed, I breathed, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. The car, Daniel hacked, spitting out bloody saliva. Find the car. I looked toward where the road should have been. The dense wall of pines seemed impenetrable, but through a small gap in the lower branches, I saw a glint of metal, a reflection. Over here, I grabbed Daniel again. We stumbled toward the glint. We pushed through the final barrier of trees and fell out onto the dirt road. The SUV was there, but Scott wasn't inside. He was standing on the roof. "Scott!" I yelled, running toward the vehicle. He was crouched on top of the luggage rack, holding a large rock in both hands. His eyes were wild, darting around the perimeter of the car. He looked like a cornered primate. "Don't touch the ground," Scott screamed at us. "Don't touch the dirt near the tires." "Get down, Scott." I reached the driver's side bore. "We have to go." "Look at the tires," he shrieked. I looked down. The tires weren't just sitting on the dirt, they were sinking. The earth around the rubber was bubbling, thick and black like tar. Tendrils of root-like vegetation were curling up around the rims, wrapping around the spokes, pulling the vehicle down. "It's eating the car," Scott sobbed. I tried to open the door, and the ground grabbed my shoe. I lost my shoe. I looked at his foot. He was wearing one sock, soaked in dark mud. "Daniel, the keys," I turned to Daniel. He was leaning against the fender, swaying. His face was a mask of red blisters and dark smears. "Pocket," Daniel wheezed. "Right pocket." I jammed my hand into his jeans pocket. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the key fusp. I yanked it out. Click.
"Get in," I shouted. I threw the back door open and shoved Daniel inside. He collapsed across the back seat. "Scott, get off the roof." Scott hesitated, looking at the bubbling earth around the car. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was right behind me. I spun around. Standing at the edge of the tree line, not 10 feet away, was a figure. It looked like Mia. It was wearing her clothes, the yellow cardigan, the jeans, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, hanging down past her knees. The neck was stretched, elongated like soft taffy. And where her face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank surface. And yet, I heard her voice in my head, clear, distinct. "Stay." "Scott," I screamed, tearing my eyes away from the thing wearing Mia's clothes. Scott saw it too. He let out a wail of pure terror and leaped from the roof, clearing the bubbling mud, and landed hard on the hood of the car. He scrambled over the windshield, slid down the side, and dove into the passenger seat. I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door. Silence. The heavy, pressurized silence of the car interior cut off the forest noise instantly. No knocking. No wind. Just the sound of our frantic breathing. Started, started, started. Scott was punching the dashboard. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered, coughed, died. "No, no, no," I begged, pumping the gas. "Come on." Outside, the thing that looked like Mia took a step toward the car. Its movement was fluid, boneless. It didn't walk. It flowed. I turned the key again. Vroom! The engine roared to life. I didn't wait for it to idle. I slammed the gear shift into reverse and floored the gas. The car lurched backward. The tires spun, screaming against the grip of the roots and mud. The vehicle shuddered, the frame groaning under the strain. "Go, go," Scott screamed. With a sickening tear, the SUV broke free. We shot backward, fishtailing on the narrow dirt road. I spun the wheel,
slamming the brakes, and shifted into drive. The headlights swept across the road ahead. The faceless Mia was standing right in front of the bumper. I didn't brake. I couldn't. I floored it. The car slammed into the figure. There was no thud of impact. No crunch of bone. The figure exploded into a cloud of black spores and wet leaves. It wasn't solid. It was just a shape made of forest debris.
The black cloud washed over the windshield, blinding us for a second. The wipers smeared it into a dark, oily streak. "Don't stop," Daniel moaned from the back seat. "Don't stop until we see pavement." I drove like a madman. The dirt road was a tunnel of horrors. Branches lashed at the windows like whips. The trees seemed to lean in, trying to snag the roof rack. The knocking followed us, a rolling thunder that seemed to keep pace with the car, echoing from the deep woods on both sides. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. "Is it following us?" asked Scott, twisting in his seat to look out the back window. "Oh God, the road. Look at the road." I glanced in the rearview mirror. Behind us, the road wasn't just disappearing into darkness. It was ceasing to exist. The trees were moving in, filling the gap the moment we passed, knitting together into a solid wall of wood. The path was closing like a zipper. "We're not driving out," I whispered, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. "We are being expelled." We drove for an hour in silence, the only sound the roar of the engine and the slapping of branches. And finally, the dirt turned to gravel. The gravel turned to cracked asphalt. We burst out of the tree line and onto the state highway. The sun was up, real sun, harsh, bright, yellow sunlight reflecting off the hood. Cars were driving past, normal cars, a pickup truck with a dog in the back, a sedan with a family. I pulled onto the shoulder and slammed the brakes. We sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the air conditioning hummed, the blinker clicked rhythmically. We were out. "We made it," Scott whispered, his voice cracking. He started to laugh, a dry, hysterical sound. "We made it out." From the back seat, Daniel sat up slowly. He wiped the dried red crust from his cheeks. His eyes were swollen shut, weeping clear fluid. "No," Daniel croaked. He leaned forward, putting a hand on my shoulder. His grip was cold. "Turn off the car," I asked. "What? Why?" "Listen." I turned the key. The engine died. We sat in the silence of the roadside. And then I heard it, faintly, coming from underneath the car, or maybe from inside the chassis itself. Knock, knock, knock. "We didn't leave," Daniel whispered. "We just brought it with us."
The sun was a liar. It hung high and bright over the asphalt of State Route 9, casting sharp, reassuring shadows that belonged to a normal Tuesday morning. But inside the SUV, the darkness of the black pines was still curled around us like cigarette smoke. We had been driving for 40 minutes. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the hum of the tires and that rhythmic, sickening sound from beneath the floorboards. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't mechanical. I know what a loose muffler sounds like. I know the rattle of a broken suspension rod. This was soft, wet. It sounded like a heavy bag of meat being slapped against the undercarriage with every rotation of the driveshaft. "Pull over!" Daniel groaned from the back seat. He was lying fetal, his hands pressed over his eyes. The red sap from the tree had dried into a crust that looked uncomfortably like a scab mask. "I can't take the noise! It's vibrating in my teeth!" "We can't stop here," I said, my grip on the steering wheel making my hands ache. "We need a town. We need a hospital."
I need to get it off, Scott yelled suddenly, startling me so bad I nearly swerved into the oncoming lane. He was staring at his feet, pressing them hard against the glove compartment as if the floor was made of lava. I saw a sign for a gas station. Miller's Stop and Shop, 2 miles. 2 miles, I said. We stop, we check the car, we wash Daniel's face, then we find the police. Scott laughed, a brittle, jagged sound. Police? What are we going to tell them? That a tree ate Mia? That the mud tried to swallow the car? We tell him she's missing, I said firmly, though my voice sounded hollow to my own ears. We tell him we got separated. We pulled into the gas station. It was a relic of the 90s, peeling paint and 2 pumps that looked like they hadn't been updated since the Bush administration. A teenage boy in a greasy vest was leaning against the ice machine, scrolling on his phone. I parked away from the pumps, near the air hose. I killed the engine. The silence returned, but the smell hadn't left. As soon as the AC died, the scent of copper and wet rot bloomed in the cabin, heavy and suffocating. Out, I commanded. We spilled out of the car like refugees. The heat of the day hit us, dry and dusty, a stark contrast to the humid tomb of the forest.
Daniel stumbled out of the back, leaning heavily on the door frame. He looked horrific. The red substance had stained his skin a deep, bruised purple. His eyes were swollen shut, weeping a clear, sticky fluid. "Bathroom," he rasped. "Take him," I told Scott. "Get him cleaned up. I'm going to see what's under the car." Scott hesitated, looking at the SUV as if it were a bomb. "I don't want to leave you alone with it." "Just go." Scott grabbed Daniel's arm and guided him toward the restroom around the side of the building. I watched them go, then took a deep breath of the gasoline-tinged air. I got down on my hands and knees. The asphalt was hot, burning my palms. I lowered my head and looked under the chassis. I expected a branch, a rock, maybe a clump of mud. What I saw made my stomach turn inside out. Wrapped tightly around the rear axle was a mass of black roots, but they weren't wood. They were fleshy, pulsating veins, thick as my wrist, glistening with that same translucent slime we had seen in the sleeping bag. They were fused to the metal, woven into the steel of the drive shaft. And in the center of the mass, trapped in the tangle of biological matter, was something white. I squinted, leaning closer, fighting the urge to vomit as the metallic stench washed over me. It was a shoe. A white sneaker. Mia's sneaker. And inside the sneaker was a foot. It had been severed cleanly at the angle, the bone protruding white and stark against the black gore. The roots were feeding on it, tiny capillaries drilling into the flesh, pulsing rhythmically as they siphoned something into the car itself. Thump. The mass contracted right in front of my eyes, slamming the shoe against the muffler. I scrambled backward, crab-walking across the pavement until my back hit the concrete barrier of the air pump. I gasped for air, the world spinning. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" I looked up. The teenage attendant was standing there, holding a rag. He was looking at me with a mix of concern and disgust. "You guys hit a deer or something?" he asked, wrinkling his nose. "Smells like rumpkill left in the sun for a week." I couldn't speak. I couldn't tell him there was a severed foot fused to my axle. "Yeah, a deer. Big one. Want me to hose it off?" He gestured to a hose coiled by the wall. "No," I shouted, too loud. "No, don't touch it. It's tangled bad. We need a mechanic. Suit yourself." The kid shrugged. "Bathroom key is with your friends."
They look rough, man. That guy's face is messed up. I stood up, my legs shaking. I had to get Daniel and Scott. We had to leave. We couldn't let anyone see this. If the police saw the foot, they wouldn't think monster. They would think murder. I ran to the restroom. The door was locked. Scott, open up! I pounded on the metal door. It won't come off, Scott's voice screamed from inside. It won't come off! I kicked the door. The lock gave way with a screech of rusted metal. The scene inside was a tableau of madness. Daniel was bent over the sink, water running full blast. He was scrubbing his face with a coarse brown paper towel, scrubbing so hard the skin was raw and bleeding. But the red stain wasn't fading, it was spreading. The veins in his neck were turning black, standing out like cords against his pale skin. Scott was standing in the corner, staring into the mirror, but he wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking at the glass itself. "Scott, we have to go," I said, grabbing Daniel's shoulder. "Daniel, stop." Daniel lifted his head. He opened his eyes. I recoiled, hitting the door frame. His eyes were gone. Not empty sockets. The structure was there, the eyeball, the iris, but the white sclera had turned a deep Vanta black, and the irises, they were shifting, swirling, like oil on water. "I can see it," Daniel whispered. His voice was calm, too calm. "What map?" I choked out. "The root system," he said, staring at me with those abyssal eyes. "It goes everywhere. It's under the concrete. It's under the gas pumps. It's wrapped around the water pipes." He pointed at the sink drain. "It's drinking." "We are leaving," I said, forcing myself to grab his arm despite the revulsion curling in my gut. "Now." We dragged Daniel out to the car. The attendant was watching us from the window now, phone to his ear. "Calling the cops? Maybe." "Get in," I hissed. "Did you see what was making the noise?" asked Scott as he buckled his seatbelt, his hands trembling. "Just a branch," I lied. "A big, wet branch. I pulled it loose." I couldn't tell him. If I told him Mia's foot was powering our escape, he would shatter. I started the car. The engine whined, struggling against the resistance of the axle, but it turned over. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was softer now, muckled, as if the mass underneath had tightened its grip, integrating itself more fully into the machine. We peeled out of the station.
"Where are we going?" Scott asked. "The police station," I said, "in the next town." "No," Daniel said from the back. He was leaning his head against the window, watching the telephone poles blur by. "They won't help." "We have to report her missing, Daniel." "She's not missing," Daniel murmured, closing his black eyes. "She's right here." I glanced at the radio display. The car didn't have Bluetooth connected. We were miles from a strong radio signal, but the digital display was flickering. Searching, searching. Then, static, loud white noise that filled the cabin. I reached to turn it off, but the volume knob didn't work. The static grew louder, layering over itself, twisting into shapes. And then through the speakers came a sound that made my blood freeze. It was the sound of inhaling. A long, wet intake of breath. "Guys?" It was Mia's voice, faint, distorted, buried under layers of mud and interference. "Why is it so dark?" "Mia!" Scott screamed at the dashboard. "Mia!" "Scott?" The voice crackled. "I'm cold. It's so crowded in here. Why did you leave me in the dark?" "Turn it off!" I smashed my fist against the console. The plastic cracked, but the voice continued. "Daniel, your eyes are so pretty now." "She's in the car," Daniel whispered, a small smile playing on his lips. "She's in the wires." I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt on the shoulder of the highway. I ripped the keys out of the ignition. The engine died. The dashboard went dark. Silence. Then from the unpowered speakers, one final whisper drifted out, clear as a bell. "Finish the trip." I looked at Scott. He was weeping silently. I looked at Daniel. He was asleep or unconscious, the black veins pulsing in his neck. We weren't escaped. We were just a larger container. I looked out the windshield. The road ahead stretched into the horizon, straight and clear. But in my peripheral vision, the trees on the side of the highway seemed to be leaning in, watching, waiting. And from beneath the car, the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. It was no longer the sound of meat hitting metal. It was the sound of knuckles rapping on a door.
Chapter 7: The Infection. The police station in the small town of Eldridge was a squat brick building that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. It was the epitome of mundane bureaucracy, a place where paperwork was the primary antagonist. We stumbled in like crash survivors, Daniel leaning heavily on me, Scott trailing behind with a 1,000-yard stare that made the receptionist drop her pen. "Help," I rasped, my throat raw from hours of screaming and recycled air. "We need help. Our friend is missing." The officer at the desk, a burly man named Deputy Haynes, looked up from his computer. His eyes narrowed as he took in our appearance, the mud-caked clothes, the wild desperation, and Daniel's face, which was now a roadmap of black veins pulsing beneath translucent skin. "Jesus, son," Haynes muttered, reaching for his radio. "What happened to you? Car accident?" "Camping," I said, the word tasting like ash. "Black Pines Reserve. She's gone. Mia. She just vanished." They separated us. Standard procedure. Or maybe they just didn't want whatever contagion Daniel had spreading through the precinct. They put Daniel in an interrogation room with a paramedic. They put Scott in the lobby with a bottle of water he refused to drink. They took me into a small office with a flickering fluorescent light. "Start from the beginning," Haynes said, clicking a pen. "Where exactly were you?" I told him everything. The forum post, the smell, the silence, the footsteps, the voice in the radio. I left out the part about the tree eating her. I left out the severed foot fused to my axle. I left out the fact that Daniel's eyes had turned into black pools of oil. If I told him that, I'd be in a padded cell before sunset. "Black Pines," Haynes repeated, frowning. He tapped his pen on the desk. "Look, kid, we'll send a search party. But if you guys were out there partying, drugs involved?" "No drugs," I snapped. "Just find her." They kept us there for hours. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. The mundane safety of the station began to erode. I could feel the forest pressing against the back of my mind.
Around 6 p.m., a commotion erupted in the hallway. I heard shouting, then a scream. Not a scream of fear, a scream of pain. "Get off me! It burns!" It was Daniel. I bolted out of the office, ignoring Haynes' shout. I ran down the hall toward the interrogation room. The door was open. Inside, 2 paramedics were trying to restrain Daniel. He was thrashing on the table, his body convulsing. But it wasn't a seizure. His skin was moving. Ripples were running under the surface of his arms and chest, like worms burrowing beneath the dermis. The black veins had thickened, turning into raised welts that pulsed in time with a heartbeat that was far too slow to be human. "Sedate him," one paramedic yelled, fumbling with a syringe. "Don't touch him," I screamed from the doorway. "Don't touch his skin." Too late. The paramedic jammed the needle into Daniel's arm. As soon as the metal pierced the skin, a spray of black fluid erupted from the puncture wound. It hit the paramedic in the face. He screamed, dropping the syringe and clawing at his eyes. "It burns! Oh God, it burns!" The other paramedic backed away, horrified. Daniel sat up. His eyes were fully black now. No white, no iris, just void. And his mouth was hanging open in a silent scream. But the sound coming out wasn't a voice. It was static. The lights in the hallway flickered. The computer monitors at the front desk buzzed and went dark. The hum of the air conditioning died. Silence. The
The station was plunged into gloom. The only light came from the emergency exit signs, casting everything in a sickly red glow. "Daniel," I whispered. He turned his head slowly. The movement was jerky, mechanical. "Finish." The voice didn't come from his throat. It came from the speakers in the ceiling. It came from the radio on the paramedic's belt. It came from the dead computer monitors. "Finish the trip." "What the hell is happening?" Haynes shouted, drawing his gun. "Don't shoot," I yelled. "You can't kill it. It's not him anymore." Daniel stood up. The restraints on his wrists snapped like dry twigs. He looked at the paramedic writhing on the floor, the man whose face was now blistering and turning gray. Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was a stretching of skin, revealing teeth that looked too long, too sharp. "Mia is lonely." The voice boomed through the building.
Then the knocking started. Knock, knock, knock. It came from the front door, the heavy glass entrance. We all turned. Standing outside, pressed against a glass, were figures, not people, shapes. They were made of shadows and mud and leaves. They looked like silhouettes cut from the forest floor. And in the center of the crowd, standing tall and terrible, was a figure wearing a yellow cardigan. Mia, or the thing wearing her clothes. She raised a hand that ended in long branching twigs instead of fingers, and tapped on the glass. Knock, knock, knock. The glass began to crack. Spiderwebs of fractures spread from where her finger touched. "Back door," Haynes roared, grabbing my arm. "Move, everyone move." We ran. Scott was already in the hallway, cowering by the water fountain. I grabbed him as we passed. "Daniel," Scott screamed, looking back. I looked back too. Daniel wasn't following us. He was walking toward the front door, toward the things outside. He reached the glass. He placed his hand against it, mirroring Mia's. The black fluid from his veins began to seep out of his pores, coating the glass, merging with the cracks. The barrier shattered. The outside rushed in. The smell of the forest, damp earth, copper, rot, flooded the sterile station. The shadows surged forward, flowing over the floor like a tide of ink. We burst out the back exit into the alleyway. Haynes' cruiser was parked there. "Get in," Haynes shouted, unlocking the doors. We piled in. Scott in the back, me in the front. Haynes jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the car into gear. As we sped away, I looked back at the station. The lights were out. The building was dark, but from every window, black vines were already spilling out, curling around the brick, pulling the structure down into the earth. And on the roof, silhouetted against the twilight sky, stood Daniel. He was watching us go, and he was waving. But his arm didn't bend at the elbow. It waved like a branch in a storm. "Where do we go?" Scott sobbed from the back seat. "There's nowhere to go. It's in the town. It's in the wires." Haynes was pale, his hands shaking on the wheel. "My house. I have a radio there. I am radio. Analog. No digital signal. Maybe we can call for the National Guard." "It won't matter," I whispered, staring at the dashboard. The GPS screen was flickering. "Turn around." The text flashed on the screen in bright green letters.
Turn around. Turn around. Turn around. I smashed the screen with my fist. "Drive," I told Haynes. "Just drive." We sped through the darkening streets of Eldridge. The town was quiet, too quiet. No cars,
No people walking dogs, just the wind rustling the trees in the front yards. But as we passed the houses, I saw them. In the windows, behind the curtains. People were watching, but they weren't moving. They were standing perfectly still, and their eyes, even from the street, I could see the glint of black oil where their eyes should have been. The infection had spread. The silence had arrived, and we were the carriers.
Chapter 8: The Frequency of Soil. The cruiser tore through the suburban streets of Eldridge, the siren off but the lights flashing. A silent, strobing scream against the dying day. Haynes drove with a white-knuckled precision that spoke of terror barely contained by training. I watched the town pass through the passenger window. It was a panorama of the impossible. Eldridge wasn't being invaded, it was being repurposed. The manicured lawns of Elm Street weren't just overgrown. The grass had turned a bruised, necrotic purple and was growing visibly, inches by the second, lashing at the tires of parked cars. The streetlights flickered in a way, dying one by one as we passed, plunging the world behind us into the gloom of the black pines. But it was the people that broke my mind. They were everywhere, standing on porches, motionless on sidewalks, freezing in the middle of crosswalks. A woman in a jogging suit stood mid-stride, one foot raised, her face turned toward the sky. An old man sat on a bench, a newspaper open in his lap, staring blankly ahead. As the cruiser's headlights swept over them, their eyes reflected the light, not with the red eye of a mammal, but with the flat, oily sheen of spilled petroleum. They didn't move. They didn't blink. They were waiting, like trees waiting for rain. "Don't look at them," Haynes barked, swerving to avoid a sedan that had crashed into a fire hydrant. The water spraying from the hydrant wasn't clear. It was thick, black sludge. "Scott," I called to the backseat. "You holding up?" Scott didn't answer. He was curled into a ball on the hard plastic seat, rocking rhythmically. A low, wet sound was coming from his chest, a rattle like a marble rolling around in a can of paint. "Scott!" He looked up. The cage mesh between us obscured his features, but I saw him smile. It was a weak, watery smile. "My foot itches," he whispered. "We'll get you looked at," I lied. "Just hold on." Haynes' house was a single-story ranch style at the end of a gravel driveway, isolated from the neighbors by a thicket of oaks. Under normal circumstances, it would have looked cozy. Now, the isolation felt like a trap. We skidded to a halt in the gravel. The sun was gone. The twilight was thick and gray, smelling of ozone and that damn metallic slaughterhouse stench. "Inside, now," Haynes ordered, popping the trunk to grab a shotgun.
I hauled Scott out of the back. He was heavy, his limbs rubbery and uncoordinated. He stumbled as his feet hit the gravel, crying out in pain. "It hurts to walk," he whined. "The ground, it's pulling me." "Pick up your feet," I grunted, dragging him up the porch steps. Haynes unlocked the door, ushered us in, and slammed the deadbolt home. He dragged a heavy oak bookshelf in front of the door. "Kitchen," Haynes commanded. "Radio is in the den, but I need to secure the perimeter first." The house was silent, a normal, domestic silence that felt fragile as glass. I sat Scott down on a kitchen chair. He slumped forward, his forehead resting on the laminate table. "Water," he croaked. I went to the sink and turned the tap. Nothing came out but a hiss of air, followed by a slow dribble of brown sludge. "Don't drink that," I said, shutting it off. "Haynes, do you have bottled water?" Haynes appeared in the doorway, looking pale. He held a bottle of whiskey. "Water main is compromised. This is all I got." He handed the bottle to Scott, who took a swig with trembling hands. "The radio," I said. "We need to call the guard, the state police, someone." "This way," Haynes said. We left Scott in the kitchen and went into the den. It was a cluttered room filled with hunting trophies and amateur radio equipment. A large ham radio setup dominated the desk,
glowing with amber light, the only reliable tech left in a world gone digital and dead. Haynes sat down and put on the headset. He began spinning the dial, the static hissing like angry snakes.
Understood, Deputy, the voice said. Stay where you are. Do not go outside. The soil is active. We know the soil is active, I shouted at the radio. Get us out of here. We are sending a unit, the voice continued. But first we need to verify the containment. Deputy, is anyone with you infected? Haynes looked at me. Then he looked toward the kitchen where Scott was sitting. One male subject, Haynes said quietly. Possible exposure. He lost a shoe in the mud. He's exhibiting lethargy. Understood, the voice said. Bring him to the microphone. We need to analyze his respiration patterns to gauge the stage of infection. It's the only way to prepare the medical team. Bring him in, Haynes told me. I ran back to the kitchen. Scott, they need to talk to you. They're sending a chopper. Scott was still slumped at the table. He didn't move. Scott? I touched his shoulder. His shirt was wet, soaked through. Scott slowly lifted his head. My stomach dropped. His eyes were still human, blue, terrified, bloodshot, but his skin? The veins in his neck were bulging, black and thick, and they were moving. They were pulsing under their dermis, slithering up his jawline, forcing his mouth open. I can't move, Scott whispered. Tears streamed down his face. Ope, I can't move my legs. I looked under the table. Scott's legs weren't there. His jeans were shredded at the knees. From the knees down, his flesh had dissolved, merging with the linoleum floor. Thick, black roots had burst from his shins, drilling into the foundation of the house, anchoring him to the spot.
"Oh God," I breathed. "It's warm," Scott sobbed. "It's so warm down there. I can feel the house. I can feel the pipes." "Scott, we have to cut you out," I stammered, looking for a knife, a saw, anything. "No," Scott said, his voice changing. It dropped an octave. The terror vanished, replaced by a flat, hollow resonance. "You can't cut the root without killing the flower." From the den, Haynes shouted, "Bring him in. We're losing the signal." "He can't move," I yelled back. Scott grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron. His hand was cold, clammy, and coated in that familiar slime. "Don't go back in there," Scott whispered. His eyes were flickering now, the blue being swallowed by the black oil. "What?" "The voice," Scott said, a trickle of black fluid leaking from his nose. "It's not coming from a base."
It's coming from the dirt. I can feel the vibration. It's mimicking. I ripped my arm free and ran back to the den. Haynes was leaning close to the speaker. "Colonel, say again." I said. The voice on the radio crackled, losing its crisp military accent and sliding into a wet, slurping drawl. "Open the door, deputy. We are already here." Haynes froze. He stared at the radio. The amber light on the display flickered and turned green, then red, then black. "You weren't invited," the radio whispered. "Knock. Knock. Knock." The sound came from the floorboards directly beneath our feet. Haynes jumped back, knocking his chair over. "It's under the house." Crack. The floorboards in the center of the den splintered upward. It wasn't a monster that burst through, it was Scott. Or rather, what was left of him. He had been pulled down through the kitchen floor, dragged through the crawl space, and pushed up through the den floor like a gruesome daisy. He was fused with the wood, his torso erupting from the debris. His arms were elongated, the fingers stretching into thin, woody tendrils that lashed out at the air. His face was gone. In its place was a smooth, concave surface of black wood dripping with sap. But the voice came from the chest cavity, which had split open to reveal a speaker-like arrangement of cartilage and bone. "Why did you leave me?" Scott's voice screamed from the chest mouth. "Why did you leave me in the dark?" Haynes raised the shotgun and fired. Boom. The shot hit the Scott thing in the shoulder, blowing off a chunk of bark and meat. Black ichor sprayed across the room. The thing didn't flinch. The tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Haynes' ankle. "Help me," Haynes shrieked as he was yanked off his feet. He was dragged across the carpet toward the hole in the floor. I grabbed Haynes' flailing arm. I bowled with everything I had. "Let go," the Scott thing roared, the voice distorting into pure static. The tendrils tightened. I heard the snap of bone. Haynes screamed, a high, thin sound that cut off abruptly as he was bowled down into the crawl space. I was left holding his hand, just his hand. The rest of him was gone, dragged into the dark earth beneath the foundation. I scrambled backward, kicking at the hole. "Come down," the voice whispered from the darkness below. I turned and ran. I scrambled over the barricade at the front door, tearing my shirt, bruising my ribs.
I threw the door open and stumbled out onto the porch. The night was fully dark now, but the yard wasn't empty. They were there, the townspeople, hundreds of them. They were standing in the yard, on the driveway, in the trees. They formed a perfect circle around the house. They weren't attacking. They were just watching. Their black eyes glinted in the moonlight, and in the center of the crowd,
Standing at the foot of the porch stairs was Daniel. He looked better, stronger. The red sores were gone, replaced by smooth gray skin that looked like polished ash. He was wearing a suit, Hanes' Sunday best, stolen from a closet somewhere? No, it was part of him. The fabric was made of woven mold. Daniel raised a hand. The crowd inhaled in unison, a sound like a gale force wind sucking the air out of the world. "The trip isn't over," Daniel said. His voice was perfect, clear, human. "We have one more stop." I backed up against the doorframe. I was trapped. The house was eating itself from the inside. The forest was waiting on the outside. I looked at my phone. 3:17 a.m. No signal. But then the screen lit up. A new message notification. From Mia. I opened it, my fingers shaking so hard I almost dropped the device. The message was a single image. It was a photo of me, standing on the porch, taken from above, from the perspective of the roof. And the text below it read, "Look up."
Chapter 9. The Canopy of Bone. I looked up. The roof of Hanes' ranch house wasn't made of shingles and tar anymore. It was a pulsating, fleshy expanse of gray membrane, stretched tight over the wooden bones of the eaves. And clinging to the edge, directly above me, was Mia. But gravity didn't seem to apply to her. She was crouching upside down, her feet fused to the gutter, her body elongated and pale like a cave salamander. Her yellow cardigan was tattered, revealing skin that was translucent and wet. Through her chest, I could see the dark, rhythmic pumping of a heart that was far too large for a human ribcage. She didn't have eyes. Where her glasses used to sit, the skin had smoothed over into a featureless mask. But as I stared up in horror, a horizontal slit opened in the center of her face. It wasn't a mouth, it was a gill. It fluttered, releasing a spray of fine black mist that smelled of copper and ozone. "Look at you," the voice echoed in my head, bypassing my ears entirely. It felt like cold fingers stroking my frontal lobe. "You're still so solid." "Get back!" I screamed, stumbling down the porch stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. I landed in the gravel driveway. The stones crunched loudly, too loudly. The sound triggered a reaction from the silent crowd of townspeople standing in the yard. Hundreds of heads snapped toward me in perfect unison. Snap. Daniel stepped forward from the front line. The moonlight, or whatever pale luminescence was filtering through the suffocating cloud cover, gleamed off his gray, polished skin. He looked like a statue carved from ash, perfect and terrible. "Don't run, OP," Daniel said. His voice was soothing, warm, completely at odds with the nightmare surrounding us. "There's nowhere to run to. The map has changed." "What did you do?" I choked out, backing away until my spine hit the hood of Hanes' cruiser. "What did you do to them?" "We didn't do anything," Daniel smiled, and I saw black ichor leaking from his gums. "We just shared the silence. We showed them the roots." Above me, the Mia thing hissed. She detached from the roof with a wet tearing sound, dropping onto the porch railing with the grace of a spider. Her limbs were wrong, too many joints, bending at angles that made my stomach heave. "You left me," she whispered, her voice vibrating the metal of the car against my back. "I didn't know," I yelled, tears blurring my vision. "We looked for you."
"You looked with your eyes," Mia said, crawling down the railing, her head cocked at a 90-degree angle. "But you didn't listen to the knocking. You didn't answer the door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from inside the cruiser behind me. I spun around. Haynes was in the driver's seat, but he was dead. I had seen him die. I had felt his hand slip from mine as he was dragged under the house. Yet there he sat, his uniform torn, his face a ruin of bark and blood. His hands were gripping the steering wheel, but they were fused to the leather. His head turned slowly toward me. "Ticket to ride," Haynes gargled, spitting up a mouthful of black soil. I scrambled away from the car, falling onto the grass. The lawn felt hot. It was breathing beneath me. The blades of grass were writhing, trying to thread themselves through the loops of my shoelaces. "Join us," the crowd whispered. It wasn't a chant. It was a statement of fact. No. I scrambled to my feet. I looked for a gap. The driveway was blocked by the wall of silent neighbors. The house was compromised, eaten by the Scott thing in the basement and the Mia thing on the porch. The woods to the left were thick with briars. But to the right, toward the ridgeline, there was a gap in the trees, a narrow path where the moonlight seemed to hit the ground. I didn't think. Instinct took over, the primal urge of the prey to flee the predator. I bolted. "He's running," Daniel sighed, sounding disappointed. "He still thinks there's an out." I sprinted across the lawn, my boots tearing through the fleshy grass. I could hear them behind me, not running, flowing. The sound of hundreds of bodies moving like a mudslide, a wet, slurping avalanche of flesh and earth. I hit the gap in the trees and plunged into the woods. I expected the familiar layout of Miller's Ridge, the hiking trails, the overlook of the town. But as I crashed through the first line of brush, the world shifted. The air temperature dropped 30 degrees in a second. The humidity spiked, coating my skin in instant sweat. The smell of the suburbs, exhaust, cut grass, asphalt, vanished, replaced instantly by the overwhelming stench of the slaughterhouse. I wasn't on Miller's Ridge anymore. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was back. I was back in the Black Pines Reserve. The trees were the same towering, charred sentinels. The ground was the same thick gray moss.
"No," I whimpered, spinning in a circle. "No, no, no." I drove away. We drove for hours. I looked back the way I had come. The path I had just run through was gone. The trees had knitted together behind me, forming a solid wall of wood and needle. I was trapped in the loop. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from everywhere now, from the trees, from the ground, from the sky. And then I saw it. Through the gaps in the black pines, about 50 yards ahead, a light flickered. It was orange, warm, inviting. A fire. I walked toward it. My legs moved on their own, drawn by a terrifying magnetism I couldn't resist. I pushed through the final thicket and stepped into the clearing. It was our campsite. The tents were there. My tent, Scott's tent, Mia's tent. The fire was roaring, crackling merrily in the pit. The cooler was sitting by the log. The camp chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and sitting in the chairs were 3 figures. From the back, they looked normal. Scott in his hoodie, Daniel in his flannel, Mia in her yellow cardigan. They were sitting perfectly still, staring into the fire. "Guys?" I whispered, my voice trembling so hard it barely registered. The figure in the center, Daniel, stood up slowly.
He didn't turn around. He just stood there, facing the fire. "We waited for you," he said. His voice was normal. It sounded like the Daniel I knew before the trip, before the smell, before the silence. "This isn't real," I said, backing away. "You're dead. You're all dead," Scott said from his chair. He turned his head. His face was gone. In its place was a hollow cavity filled with swirling black spores. "And we are very, very connected." Mia stood up next. She turned around. She was holding something. It was a sleeping bag. My sleeping bag. "You're tired," she said gently. Her face was the smooth, eyeless mask I had seen on the roof, but her voice was filled with a terrible, motherly affection. "You've been running for so long. The trip is almost over." "I'm not staying," I screamed. I turned to run back into the darkness, anywhere away from that fire. But as I turned, I slammed into something hard. I looked up. It was a tree, but it wasn't bark. It was a leg, a massive, pillar-like leg, made of woven muscle and wood. I looked higher, towering above me, reaching up into the canopy, was a creature that defied sanity.
It was 50 feet tall, composed of hundreds of human bodies fused together, melted into a single groaning trunk. Faces pressed out from the bark, the townspeople, the gas station attendant, Deputy Haynes. They were all there, their eyes black, their mouths open in a silent chorus. And at the very top, crowning the horror, was a massive antlered head made of black roots. The entity looked down at me. "You weren't invited," the voice boomed, vibrating the marrow in my bones. Then the head tilted, and the voice softened to a wet whisper. "But you are required." The ground beneath me opened up. It didn't crumble, it unzipped. Thick, fleshy lips parted in the moss, revealing a throat lined with teeth made of jagged stone. I tried to jump, I tried to scream, but the roots shot up from the soil, wrapping around my ankles. They were warm, they pulsed, they felt like hands. "Finish the trip," the Daniel thing said from the fireside. "Finish the trip," the Mia thing whispered. "Finish the trip," the Scott thing rattled. The roots yanked me down. I fell into the earth. The smell of old blood overwhelmed me. The darkness swallowed me whole. And as the lips of the earth sealed shut above my head, cutting off the view of the false stars, the last thing I heard was the sound of the forest exhaling. Finally.
The Chapter 10, The Root and the Rot. The sensation wasn't falling, it was swallowing. I didn't plunge into a cavern or a pit. I sank into a throat. The earth around me was warm, wet, and pulsing with a rhythmic muscular contraction that squeezed the air from my lungs. The smell of copper and old blood wasn't just a scent anymore. It was the atmosphere. I was breathing it, tasting it, drowning it. I tried to thrash, to claw my way back up to the firelight, but my arms wouldn't obey. They felt heavy, distant, as if the nerves connecting them to my brain had been replaced with something slower, something woody. As I descended, the darkness began to shift. It wasn't the absence of light. It was a different kind of light. Bioluminescence flickered in the soil, veins of glowing violet and sickly green that traced complex geometric patterns through the dirt. I saw them, suspended in the earth like flies in amber were the others.
Scott was to my left, curled in a fetal position, encased in a translucent sack of slime. His face was peaceful, slack, his eyes closed. But countless tiny white tendrils were drilled into his skull, pulsing with light. Mia was below him, her body elongated, stretched out like a root seeking water. She wasn't wearing her yellow cardigan anymore. Her skin had become the cardigan, textured and yellowed like old parchment. And Daniel was everywhere. His form had dissolved, spreading out into a web of black nervous tissue that connected us all. You see, the voice didn't come from my ears. It bloomed in the center of my mind, flowering like a dark orchid. We never left the fire. The realization hit me harder than the suffocation. The escape, the SUV, the bubbling mud, the gas station, the police station, the town of Eldridge. None of it had happened. We hadn't driven away. We hadn't fought monsters in a suburban house. We had been taken hours ago, perhaps the moment the fire first died. The escape was a collective dream, a hallucination fed to our dying brains to keep the synapses firing while the forest integrated our biology. A neural pacifier. I tried to scream, but my mouth was full of soil. It wasn't real. Reality is just consensus, the Daniel voice whispered, echoing through the root system. And we have reached a new consensus. I felt a sharp, stinging pain in my ankles, then my knees, then my hips. I looked down, or what felt like down. My legs were gone. In their place were two thick, black taproots.
Digging deeper into the gloom, my jeans were shredding, the fibers merging with the moss. My hands, still clawing uselessly at the dirt, were stiffening. My fingers were lengthening, turning into twigs. I wasn't dying. I was being planted. No! I pushed a thought through the network, a desperate, jagged spike of denial. I am OP. I am human. I have a life. You have a function. Mia's voice drifted in, sweet and terrible. You are the voice. The pressure increased. My vision began to fracture. The glowing veins in the earth grew brighter, blinding me. The metallic taste became a roar of sound. And then, silence. I gasped, sitting bolt upright in bed. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My sheets were soaked in cold sweat. I scrambled for the lamp on my nightstand, knocking over a glass of water. Click. The soft yellow light of my bedroom flooded the space. I looked around wildly. The poster of the vintage Mustang on the wall, the pile of laundry in the corner, the digital clock glowing red on the dresser. 3:16 a.m. I touched my face. Skin, stubble, sweat. I looked at my hands. 10 fingers, flesh and bone, no bark, no sap. Oh God, I wept, burying my face in my hands. Oh God, it was a dream. It had been a year, exactly 1 year since the trip, since the accident. The police report said we had been attacked by a bear. That's what they told me in the hospital. Daniel, Scott, and Mia were gone, dragged off. I was the only one found wandering the highway, dehydrated and raving about trees eating people. PTSD, that's what the therapist called it. Survivor's guilt manifesting as elaborate hallucinations. I took a deep, shaky breath. The nightmare had been so vivid this time. I could still smell the copper. I could still feel the soil in my throat. I swung my legs out of bed. I needed water, real water. I walked to the window to close the blinds. The street outside was quiet. The suburban neighborhood of Oak Creek was asleep.
Streetlights hummed. A cat darted across a lawn. Normal. Everything was normal. I looked at my phone on the nightstand. 3:17 a.m. The signal bars in the top corner flickered. 4 bars. 2 bars. 1 bar. No service. A cold dread, heavier than gravity, settled in my stomach. Thump. A sound from downstairs. Thump. It wasn't a settle of the house. It was a footstep. Heavy. Wet. I froze. It's just the house. I whispered to myself. It's just the pipes. Thump. Thump. Thump.
It was circling, just like in the woods, walking around the perimeter of the living room. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept behind the door. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. I crept into the hallway. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of my house, lemon pledge and old carpet. It was the smell of damp earth, of rot, of old blood left in the rain. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice cracked. No answer. I reached the top of the stairs. The living room below was pitch black. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct raps, but they didn't come from the front door. They came from the floorboards, from the walls, from the ceiling. The house was knocking. I backed away, retreating into my bedroom. I slammed the door and locked it. I backed up until I hit the window. My phone buzzed. A voicemail. I stared at the screen. Unknown caller. My thumb hovered over the play button. I knew I shouldn't. I knew with a certainty that bypassed logic that listening to this would end me. But I had to know. I pressed play. Static, white noise, the sound of wind dragging through pine branches. Then, a voice. It was my voice. "Why did you leave me with them?" the recording of me whispered. I dropped the phone. "Come finish the trip." The phone continued from the floor, the volume rising on its own. I turned to the window. I needed to get out. I would jump. I didn't care if I broke a leg. I unlocked the latch and threw the sash up. There was no street outside. There was no Oak Creek, no street lights, no neighbor's cat. There was only a wall of tall black pines, pressing right up against the glass. The branches scraped against the screen like skeletal fingers trying to get in. And standing there, floating in the darkness just beyond the window, were 3 figures. Daniel, Scott, Mia. They weren't human. They were woven from the forest itself, bark, moss, and wet leaves mimicking the shapes of my friends. Their eyes were hollow voids leaking black sap. They were smiling. "You never woke up, OP," Daniel said. His voice didn't come from outside. It came from inside my own head. "We just let you dream for a while." "Why?" I sobbed, backing away from the window. "Why are you doing this?" Mia floated closer, her face pressed against the screen. "Because," she whispered, "roots need to spread." I looked down at my hands. They were turning gray. The skin was hardening, cracking, turning into birch bark.
My feet were fusing to the carpet. No, not carpet. Moss. The floor of my bedroom was turning into gray moss. My phone lay on the moss, the screen glowing bright green. It wasn't playing a voicemail anymore. It was recording. I felt the urge rising in my throat. A pressure. A need. It wasn't my thought. It was the forest's thought, pushing through my vocal cords. I fell to my knees, my legs no longer my own. I crawled toward the phone. I knew what I had to do. I had to leave the message. I had to warn you.
No, not warn. Invite. I picked up the phone. My wooden fingers tapped the screen. I used to think the woods were peaceful. I whispered into the microphone. My voice sounded wet and thick, like mud bubbling in a swamp. Quiet. A place where people escaped stress. I am still here. I am in the dirt. And I am waiting for you. Come finish the trip. The end.